Celine, what do you think about? Awesome. Great. Welcome to session 3 of the Colonial Healing, Embodied Healing for Inherited and Colonial Trauma. I'm Denise, your guide and space holder for the series. And today we're actually going to start talking a little bit about what trauma is and how trauma shows up for us in our day-to-day. So the reason why we want to know about trauma in relation to healing inherited and colonial trauma is because that's what it is, right? It's an impact on our bodies, whether that's been passed down through generations. There's a field of study called epigenetics that shows how trauma, not only trauma, but other things as well, like traits, personality traits, characteristics, and trauma gets passed down from one generation to the next. And the nature of colonialism, of whiteness as a culture, and of systemic racism and colonialism, white supremacy, is that even though it's systemic, it's, a group of people who participate in an institution or a system of thinking, there are still individual bodies that are within that system, right? And so we are one of those bodies that live within a system of white supremacy and colonialism. And so when we begin to heal our trauma, whether that's personal trauma, inherited trauma, or systemic trauma, we're still healing trauma. And the more we learn how to meet ourselves when it comes to the trauma that's in our bodies, eventually we'll be able to grow in capacity to meet that systemic trauma. So it begins with the me, right? Like starting with knowing how to heal my own trauma, whether again that's personal, developmental, or maybe you focus on more of the systemic. At the baseline of it, trauma affects our bodies in the same way. And so that is the focus for today's call, is to really actually get a temperature check for what you understand about trauma, what you think about when it comes to healing trauma. So we'll have a portion for sharing. And then I'll talk about what trauma is and how we can begin to heal. Because the nature of trauma is that it's ingrained, right? There are patterns, behaviors, and especially when it comes to the systemic trauma, because it's passed down, so it sometimes looks like culture, right? So these cultures and behaviors and patterns are so deeply ingrained in our body and our psyche, both the body and the psyche, that in order to undo them, it's not like a switch that we can just flip, right? It requires slow, gentle, iterative practices and doable actions and behaviors that slowly shift us towards health. So if you think about like a big boat, right? Or maybe instead of a boat, you think of like a massive yacht. And it's like going pretty fast in the ocean, and it has, a momentum, right? And so perhaps we've been moving in this momentum of trauma for so long. And in order for us we can see now perhaps that, oh, we've been going the wrong way. This is not working for me anymore. Now I want to turn my direction towards health. And maybe we see health over there. Say, for example, it's like an island, right? Where we are the embodiment of our health, the embodiment of what it means to live in a culture where all living beings are liberated and have access to their inherent power. So perhaps that's the destination that we want to get to. And now this boat is going fast. There's that momentum. It's actually impossible for us to just turn the whole boat around and say, skirt, we're going this way now. The boat might topple, we might hurt ourselves, the boat will very likely crash into something because it's going so fast. And so we have to gently, slowly, little by little, turn the steering wheel towards health. It's not a one big drastic shift towards health. I know ideally that's what we would want, right? Especially when we now are aware of the gravity of the situation. Perhaps when we become aware of how trauma has been affecting us, again, both personally and collectively, there might be this need to shift to go straight towards health. But the small iterative actions are moving the needle right towards health, and it takes time. And so we start with the practice that I'm sharing with you today as a way to begin the process of healing and undoing trauma in the body. So that's what we're doing today. Okay, now that I have the context set up, let's go into our orienting and grounding practice. And if there are any requests, please feel free to drop it in the chat for me. And this orienting practice is actually one of the practices, and the reason why we start all the time with this practice is because it meets a momentum of trauma response. So sometimes a trauma, and we'll talk about this in a moment, but sometimes when we show up to a space, we might not be fully present, right? Because we're moving quickly, or perhaps we're actually maybe in a bit of more of like a collapse, a freeze, where we're feeling a little bit tired or fatigued or disconnected, or maybe we might be the complete opposite, where we're hyper vigilant, or perhaps a little bit anxious, right? Moving fast. So one being the accelerator and the other being like the brakes. And so this orienting practice helps us regulate their nervous system from, instead of being really fast to really slow, to having some form of regulation. And so for today, it might be helpful to sway your body from side to side and finding a natural rhythm for you today. So again, if you're moving fast, maybe just noticing that, okay, I'm feeling a bit fast. So maybe I can slow down just a notch. It doesn't have to be a complete swing. Again, it can be gradual. Any amount of slowing down that feels doable for you. Or if you're feeling perhaps a little bit more on the slower, fatigued, a bit numb side, maybe just adding a little bit of movement and just seeing how that feels, how that might relate to the speed that you're currently embodying. For me, I'm feeling a little bit fast, and so I'm slowing down the swing. And as I'm doing this, I'm starting to orient around me. I'm looking around with my eyes, and I'm naming colors, objects, and textures. Noticing the depth and distance between objects and my body. And I'm also listening for sounds that are around me, and I'm noticing that there's quite a lot of sounds, so it makes sense to me why I might be a little bit fast, might be a little bit stimulated because there's so much happening. But just orienting to them is helping my body, my nervous system say, okay, I'm here, and I can notice what's happening around me without needing to respond to it. I can if I want to, but I don't need to. And let's take a deep breath here. If it feels right to you, you can inhale and slowly exhale. We'll do one more inhale. And this time as you exhale, let out a sigh. We'll do one more like that. Inhale. Beautiful. And just gently lean back into the support behind and beneath you. Perhaps noticing what your hands, your fingertips might be touching, noticing the texture or the sensation of what's beneath you. And now gently bringing your awareness to your back body. And it's okay if you don't sense anything in particular, just gently bringing the awareness to where your body and the chair meets. And I wonder if by bringing the awareness there, you notice anything in terms of warmth, temperature, texture, weight, or speed. For me, I feel like there is some warmth. It feels soft, yet supportive. And I can feel the surface area of my back that's being supported by the chair. And so what I'm doing is I'm bringing awareness to sensation on my skin, and I'll offer some context later as to why this helps when it comes to healing trauma. So from here, just gently draw your awareness and down towards your roots. Perhaps taking a moment to notice what your roots look like today, allowing for them to grow down and deep towards the core of the earth, moving through layers and layers of soil, of sand, down through the mycelium network, down through the gaseous layers, watery layers, down towards the fiery core. Remembering that we are a part of nature, and that too, if it feels relative to you, that perhaps something in nature mirrors what's happening for you in your own life. Perhaps the full moon today might reflect intensity, or perhaps the peak of a momentum that has been growing over the last 2 weeks from the new moon. Or maybe with the fall equinox happening last Tuesday, perhaps you're feeling a sense of abundance, of harvesting seeds that you might have planted. Or maybe what feels right and true for you today is the roots that are deeply connected to the earth, that perhaps help ground you into your space, your taking up of space in this moment. And I wonder, as you attune to what nature might be able to offer you today, if there's any sense of support, of nourishment, of resource that nature can offer you in this moment. Maybe it's a texture or a quality. So for me, is what's coming up for me is this feeling of rooting. Actually, it feels very simple and basic, but that's what feels most right for me in this moment, is this desire to root down and feel stable. And so by imagining roots and root systems, first of mine and of the root systems of other plant life around me, there's a sense that I'm supported, that I get to take up space deep down where there's enough room for all. And so I wonder how your body might relate to this nourishing support. For me, I feel like my center of gravity is more present. I feel like I am more stable. I feel my feet on the floor and it feels supportive. I feel very present to what's happening around me, the noise, the energy in our space. And so we'll take a few moments here just to allow for however this resourcing with nature practice felt like for you in the body to integrate a bit more. To create some space, some energetic capacity at the level of the body to meet the content that we have today. And by attuning to health, attuning to a natural way of being, perhaps it might offer a little bit more context, a little bit more affirmation for how we might be feeling. That maybe we aren't so alone in our process, that maybe something in nature not only mirrors where we are, but can also offer support. And maybe those two things are different. Maybe what's mirrored is the intensity of the full moon, but what feels supportive is the grounding into the roots. And this is something that you can do at any time, using nature as an oracle, as a way to meet yourself, as a way to remember a way of being that brought us closer to the earth, closer to an indigenous way of being. Yeah, let's take 2 to 3 clearing breaths here. Inhale to fill up. Exhale, relax the shoulders if it feels doable. 2 more. Beautiful. If your eyes aren't already open, you can gently blink them open once more. And slowly coming back to the space. I'm curious how that felt for you, what in nature perhaps was your resource, or perhaps the mirror for where you are in your life right now. If you want to drop it in the chat, I'd love to hear before we move on. Celine, can you make sure that I have recording permission? Thank you. So Someone said, I was imagining being in the mountains during last winter. I visited the San Bernardino Mountains and I felt so at peace. I took myself there right now. So beautiful. Thanks for sharing. I imagine leaning against a giant redwood. Wow. I love that. Yes, I hope that that was resourcing for you. I hope that felt nourishing. Okay, great. Yes, I do now. Thank you, love. Yeah, that those sound like really amazing, amazing resources. And really, I'd love to invite you into considering this practice as something that you get to do on your own, perhaps as a daily practice to feel more connected to nature, right? I think right now there's a lot that's happening in the collective field. And so sometimes it might be nice to feel really resourced, to find a sense of inner peace by connecting to something that's natural, right? Like trees and mountains. And also, like, I love that you both chose something that was really stable and predictable, right? Like, a giant redwood stays there for most of his life until it comes to its natural or forced removal or death, right? Same thing with a mountain. Those are so stable and predictable, right? Even as the seasons change, there's something unbreakable, there's something unchanging about huge trees and mountains. So perhaps, right, with this resourcing practice, like perhaps there's something within you that's like a mountain, something within you that's like a giant redwood that is unbreakable and predictable amidst changing climates, amidst intensity in the collective field, that there is something within you alongside the intensity, right? Not bypassing, not saying like, oh, I'm not part of this intensity or the collective field because I'm a tree, but rather there is something within me that is like a mountain or a redwood tree that can meet the intensity of the collective field right now. How does that land? Great. Awesome. Okay. So I'm going to skip over the introduction today since both of you know who I am. And for those of you watching the recording, you can read this slide or watch the two recordings from the first two sessions where I went in depth into introducing myself, as well as the acknowledgements. I'm going to briefly acknowledge the keepers of the land. I am here on Kumeyaay territory. I want to acknowledge my teachers, Rachel Maddox, among many others, ancestors of those here and watching the recording. Thank you for having our highest and best and interest, and for bringing us together in this space so that we may heal the ancestral and inherited trauma that we currently live within. I want to acknowledge the Black Lives Matter movement that continues to fight against systemic injustices as well as cultural injustices, and acknowledge that we are here to support this movement, but not only that, to help undo and change culture towards liberation for all. I also want to acknowledge the lives that are continuing to be impacted by COVID-19, for the essential workers, frontline workers, and all that have been impacted by the pandemic. And Last but not least, I also want to acknowledge you for being here. If you're here live with me, thank you so much for showing up to care for yourself, to learn more about this topic, which I know isn't always easy on top of everything that you already have going on. So thank you for choosing you. It truly means a lot to me. And the same goes to you if you're watching the recording. Thank you for taking care of yourself and engaging in this content when it's the right time for you. I'm going to skip through this as well since I know both of you that are here today. And if you want, you can share how you are feeling today, maybe an animal or a color that describes how you are feeling. And that's actually what we're going to do for now. So I'm going to pause the recording, and both of you are invited to unmute yourself if you want to share how are you feeling today and any guidance perhaps if it feels supportive. So you can pause the recording. Sharing. I just did the resume recording. So for those of you watching the recording, we just did a short guidance. I guided one of the participants here in meeting some energetics in the body through the practice of relating to nature, which is blueprint, and creating capacity to meet perhaps intensity or energetics in the body that might feel like trauma. So that's what we did. Okay, so group agreements, since everyone that's live here has heard this, I'm going to move on. So we're moving into the content for today. So I'm curious, what do you think of when you think of trauma? And I know I've shared a lot already, so if that's what you think of when you think of trauma, please feel free to let me know so that I know that, okay, that's registering. So please put in the chat, what do you think of when you think about trauma? What do you understand about trauma? What comes to mind? Separation from the body. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And emptiness, or the opposite of fullness, opposite of joy too. Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah, so trauma feels like there's this like hollowing of the fullness of our human experience, perhaps, which relates to the body. I used to think that trauma was when your body experienced shock through a traumatizing experience, but I learned that it can be inherited. Yes, absolutely, Daniela. And I would also add that trauma is not only a shock experience and inherited experience, but it can also be developmental. So it can also look like childhood adverse experiences that compounded over time. It can be things like emotional and physical gaslighting or abuse. And it can also be like neglect during childhood. So trauma can look like many different things. Can be very small but not small, you know, in terms of like how the body responds to something that is potentially perceived as a threat or a real threat. And so I'm curious now, what do you think of when it comes to healing trauma? What are some of the ways that you've heard or maybe has worked really well for you relating to healing trauma? Yeah, it is interesting. Yes, it's a very common misconception that trauma is something that's like a one-time thing, but trauma is actually anything that our body perceived as a threat. It's not just the body, actually, it's also the brain. So it's really the brain, but then the brain responds to the body. So it's what we perceive through our senses as a threat, and it signals to our brain that we're under threat, and it initiates a trauma response. Patience, yes, it does require patience, absolutely. So, so true. I'm a testament to that for sure. What else do you think of when it comes to healing trauma? Talking about your personal experiences with others. Absolutely. Yes, yes, yes. That is why it's so beautiful that we get to share in this space, because then we feel like we're not alone in our healing, right? Yeah. Okay. So, what actually is trauma? What causes trauma? So, this is a bunch of words. I'm gonna talk, and feel free to listen and listen in terms of like just listening, but not needing to like take notes or like really hold on to the words that I'm saying. Rather, can you perhaps notice how the body might be receiving this information? So trauma is essentially their energetic imprints on the nervous system, and they show up as physical manifestations. So energetic imprints on the nervous system that was caused by an overwhelming amount of real or perceived threat. So what happens is, in the moment where we feel unsafe, I'm going to use the example of neglect, because that was one of the traumas that I experienced growing up that I've been really like deeply healing. And so there was a moment in my healing where I remembered, through a somatic session, that I time traveled to a moment where I felt really young, and that what I needed was to be held, but there was no one there to hold me. And so what happens in a moment like that is that even though nothing bad was actually happening to me, but my need to feel safe through feeling held, by being held, was not being met. And so my brain perceived that as I'm not safe. And so what happens is our reptilian brain, our lizard brain, right, which is at the, if we think of this as our brain, my fist right here, this back here is the reptilian brain, and this is our prefrontal cortex, where memory and cognition lives. And when we lift that, on the inside here's the amygdala, and this is what controls and regulates our fight or flight, our autonomic nervous system, which tells our body to breathe, to digest, things that we don't need to like actively tell our body to do, but it just knows how to do, and that's what regulates that. And so what happens is, when we experience something threatening, our lizard brain signals to our amygdala that we're under threat. So what happens is this part gets inflamed, and it goes ding, ding, ding. And what happens is our cognition goes offline. So sometimes we say we flip the lid, right? We flip the lid, and so we're not thinking rationally. Memory might be lost during this time, because again, this governs memory, right? So if that part's offline, then it's not registering. And instead, what's happening is this is telling our body to initiate a fight or flight response in order to get to safety. And so I'm just going to pause here for a moment, because sometimes hearing this information, we might dissociate, and that might feel like a bit of spaciness, maybe like you're hearing words but they're not really registering, and that's okay. It's normal. And so I wonder if there's anything that can help you bring yourself into the present moment. A few options: feeling your feet on the ground, like drawing your energy down to the feet. Like, here are my feet, they're on the floor, it feels cold. Or feeling the back body on the chair, like we did earlier. Perhaps looking around the space, orienting using the senses once more. Or maybe drinking some water. Just letting your body not need to, rather letting your body have its process and doing what you can to meet it by bringing yourself into the present moment. So to be clear, I'm not saying don't dissociate. I'm saying it's okay if you're dissociating. Here's how you can meet that part of yourself. And it's okay if you aren't even noticing that. It takes practice and awareness to get to a point where you can say, I'm dissociating. So I'm just going to continue, but please feel free to drop in the chat if anything comes up for you. And I am more than happy to pause because it's important to me. Okay. So, great. I'm glad that it was helpful. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Thank you for sharing. Feelings of things being wrong with me because of experienced trauma. Yeah. I hear you. And I just want to affirm that there's nothing wrong with you because you've experienced trauma. It wasn't your fault that that happened, both of you and to everyone listening. These things happen because our caregivers, our parents, our adults didn't have the tools to be able to meet us in those times, perhaps, or we didn't have the tools to be able to help ourselves. And you're here now, and you get to start healing now. And the feelings of something might be wrong with me is absolutely valid because we didn't know at the time, but we get to start without bypassing what you're feeling. It's valid and real, and I just wanted to say that it's okay that you feel that way. Yeah. 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 And Celine, I know it's a tender time for you right now, so just know that just know that I care about you and we care about you, and please feel free to do what you need to take care of yourself. Yeah. Should I continue? Do we feel good? Okay, Daniela, just a quick yes or no would be great. Okay, awesome. So where we stopped was our amygdala signals to our body to initiate a fight or flight response in order to find safety. And so what happens in the body is there's a surge of adrenaline and cortisol, which are stress hormones, right? And these hormones are meant to help us move faster and quicker so that we can get to safety, to either defend ourselves, fight response, or leave, flight response, so that we get to safety. What happens when we are not able to attain that sense of safety? What happens when all of that stress hormones, so adrenaline and cortisol, gets activated but doesn't get used up towards safety? It ends up getting trapped in the body, in the nervous system, which is a freeze response, which is a natural thing to happen because it's storing that energy to be used for later. So for example, if you imagine like an impala running in the fields away from a cheetah, right? It's in a fight and flight response, and it's running very quickly because it's all this adrenaline. And say, for example, it ends up getting caught by the cheetah. What happens then, it freezes. It freezes all of that fight flight energy and kind of like plays dead. It collapses, right? And the reason that happens is because, say if the cheetah happens to get distracted, or it thinks it's done the job and it leaves the cheetah there and goes and gets it's whatever, it leaves the space, the cheetah can then wake up out of its freeze response and then use that energy that was stored and run. However, as humans, sometimes when we experience a freeze response, we might not know how to, in that moment, discharge that excess energy. We might not have the tools, we didn't know how to, or our cognitive brain comes back online and we start to rationalize what happened. Or because the event was so overwhelming that when memory and cognition does come online, we dissociate from it because there is no memory. We can't make sense of what happened, and so dissociation happens. This is a healthy and normal response of the body, right? This trauma, rather it's an emergency response. There's an emergency that's happening, and this is what my body does in order to find safety. It becomes trauma when the energy that's stored in the nervous system does not complete, does not discharge completely and transform into safety. So what needs to happen is that energy needs to get discharged, and our animal body needs to feel safe, whether that's being held or cocooning, getting something that will make me feel safe, for trauma to be completed, so that it doesn't become trauma, rather, so that the emergency response becomes completed and it doesn't become trauma. So when that energy is stored in the nervous system, over time, that's what shows up as symptoms of trauma. How are we feeling? Does that make sense? Are we doing okay? Yeah. And Celine, I know you have to hop off soon. Totally understand if you want to leave, want to stay, up to you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yes. Take care, and I will see you in 2 weeks, and I'll probably reach out to you on Instagram after this. Yeah. Okay. Bye. Enjoy your week. Take care. Happy full moon. Okay. How are you feeling, Dee? Okay, great. I'm glad. Okay, good. So now I'm going to talk about symptoms of trauma. So now we understand what causes trauma and how it happens and why it happens. What happens now that, rather, how does trauma then show up for us? Right? We understand the emergency response, we understand the fight or flight, and now we understand what exactly is trauma. It's that stored energy in our body that has not completed, and it's causing symptoms because the truth is it wants to complete itself. And so oftentimes we feel these symptoms happen because the trauma is signaling to our body saying, hey, there's something that we need to discharge. But because of, humanity, day-to-day life stressors, we don't know how to meet the trauma. There's not a container for the trauma to resolve itself. And so these are the symptoms that trauma might show up in. And what we can do is we can begin to listen to these symptoms through the process of somatic healing in order to complete and transform trauma. And so one of the first ones is hyperarousal. Oftentimes, this is if you think about like trauma, like shock trauma, it's very easy to see like an order of appearance of symptoms of trauma based on when the trauma first happened. However, if it's more like over time and developmental, it gets a little bit more complex. And so sometimes it can be a mix of all of these things. But essentially, what normally happens first is hyperarousal. In a hyperaroused state, we might feel agitated, we might feel a little grumpy, we might feel on a more extreme side really anxious, unable to relax, right? Like there's this feeling of like, I need to control things around me. This speed, heart rate elevation, temperature rising, and any kind of like hyper arousal, whatever that word like brings to mind for you. If that shows up in the body, that's normally, it can be a symptom of trauma. It's also important to note that not all symptoms of trauma, or all of these symptoms are trauma. For example, the second one, constriction, right? What happens when we experience a trauma response is our body is constricting so that we can move faster. And so sometimes digestion will stop because the body wants all the energy to go towards safety. And so sometimes we might feel stomach ache, but that's not because it's a trauma response. Most times it is, but not all the time. But constriction, like the stomach starts to constrict because digestion isn't happening, because all of the energy is going towards the blood vessels, thinning, hyper focused on like getting towards safety. So constriction of the body, the muscles contract, right? Because there's this need to move fast. Are you with me so far? Maybe this would be a good time to pause. I know I need to pause. I'm feeling some of that hyperarousal myself. And so I'd love to invite you to lean back into your seat with me. Perhaps noticing the feet once more. Looking around the room. And oftentimes with hyperarousal, it's helpful for the energy to go downwards. So I'm just imagining my roots growing down towards the soil of the earth. Okay. Let me know at any time if you would like us to pause. Until then, I'm going to continue. We talked a little bit about dissociation earlier today as well, and that's, yeah, totally. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so dissociation is that freeze response, right? The body is overwhelmed with the fight or flight, or the hyperarousal, or the constriction that we might leave. We might, our cognitive brain might leave because the body is going, like, it's like the cognition is going offline so that the body can do what it needs to do. But oftentimes it keeps happening because when we come back into cognition, the trauma has still not been resolved. And so it might be like this dance between like, okay, I'm dissociating, but now I'm coming back to the body, and I'm like, okay, I'm here, but then it happens again because we still haven't done the time traveling towards where the trauma first happened and resolving it in that moment by making sure that whatever need for safety is being met. The fourth one is freeze, and it's a little bit different than dissociation, because dissociation, we leave and then sometimes we come back, sometimes we leave and then, you know, for more severe cases, a lot of people, narcissistic people are in deep dissociation. They're operating from like in autopilot. Dissociation is normally when we're in autopilot. Freeze, on the other hand, is when we can't even function. We're collapsed. We're like, say, out for the count, right? We're numb. Maybe we're using substances to get by, because essentially the whole body is frozen. There's no capacity to function. Fawning is one that I think is very, very, very common, especially for folks who have been historically oppressed and marginalized, which is a hypersocial trauma response. And this trauma response is basically when we people please, or when we try to meet the needs of everyone else, because the idea is that if I can make sure everyone is safe and happy, that means they won't be a threat to me. That means I can be safe and well. So hyper socializing, right? Sometimes it looks like codependency, but oftentimes it's like this saying yes to whatever the person that is holding perhaps power dynamics over us, as a form of survival, right? So collectively, personally, systemically, there can be hypersocializing happening. So this one's a big one. I'm just going to pause there and see how that landed for you, how everything is landing for you so far. And this is the last slide that we have for today, that before we go into like how to then begin healing. Yeah, it's very common, Bonnie. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Both those places you mentioned, the job and school, are places where we often feel like we have to fawn. Yeah. So one thing I wanted to offer you as a form of like blueprint, right? Blueprint being, okay, we understand like all this is imprint, right? This is trauma. Blueprint says you matter, your needs, your desires matter. You have choice. You are a sovereign being, meaning you get to decide what is best for you, what is right for you. And even though it might not feel this way right now, perhaps even imagining that you matter, imagining the possibility even that you have choice, that you get to choose. How might that feel? How might that land? How might that create perhaps a sense of possibility of healing, where we might not felt like where we might have once felt like we didn't matter or that we didn't have choice. The truth is we do have choice. We do have agency. It's about being able to first imagine the possibility, so creating neural networks towards that possibility. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Choice and sovereignty. Yes. So perhaps a practice for you that might feel really, yes, exactly, not letting others decide for you. perhaps a practice that you can start, because again, we talked about how trauma is like little by little, right? So what is a very small and doable action that you can take perhaps once a day for like a very small thing, maybe like a 2-minute thing or a 3-minute thing, where you have choice and agency and sovereignty. Very small and simple, but what's happening is you're creating the muscle for it, so that eventually over time, when there is a moment where you have to choose something really big, you have that muscle. You've practiced that muscle with smaller decisions, right? So maybe it can be something like, I'm going to choose intentionally something I want to eat today. Like coming into this sense of like, I'm going to let my body tell me what's a yes in terms of something I want to choose, right? And the reason why we come to the body is because it's where the body is where trauma lives, and so it's in the body where we will feel and experience blueprint. Yeah. So maybe also like another example could be you could choose one thing. You can let your body decide one thing for you a day that feels like it'll be really, really supportive or nourishing. So maybe it's saying no, right? Because part of choosing is saying no, right? That's a very big part of choice, right? Um, and also changing your mind, right? Yes, no, I change my mind. All these are options to you at any time. And so maybe you change your mind for something that you decided as it was a yes yesterday or earlier today, or you say no to something. So how can you begin to practice that muscle of yes, no, I change my mind in small and doable ways, like very small things, so that eventually you have the muscle for saying yes, no, I change my mind to much bigger in your life, where maybe in the past you might have felt that sense of I don't have a choice, but now I do. Does that make sense? Yeah, I hear you, Jayla. That's such a um that's so common, so normal. I have that same thing, and I want you to. I would love to invite you to the possibility that you matter, and that it's possible to be able to say no. Yeah, it takes time, um, but I am trusting because I also really just want to like amplify and appreciate you for like showing up every week for every session, because it's not easy, and um, it shows your commitment to healing. It shows your desire, and it shows actually already how much health there is in your own, lived experience, because you're seeking health. That healthy part of you is seeking health, right? Because I think sometimes when we think about trauma, we're like, I'm stuck here, I'm helpless, I can't do anything about this, right? But you showing up is showing that you want to heal. And by being here, you are healing because you're receiving all of this language. Yeah, exactly. You're receiving this language, you're sitting with it, and it's allowing your body to integrate. And eventually, you'll find the experiences, the opportunities for your trauma to complete. Right now, you're just getting information. You're kind of like, okay, I understand what that looks like, how it looks like. Now you know what to look for. And eventually, you'll have the opportunity, whether that's working really intentionally with a person like a healer, or in your relationships. A lot of my trauma healing has happened in relationships. I do have a mentor, a somatic healing practitioner that I learn from and do healing sessions with, but so much of my trauma is healed in relationships, because it's in relationships where trauma happens. So it's definitely possible if you're doing it. Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah, of course. So the last three, I'll just name hypervigilance. So that's like that need to control, that it's like this hyper awareness of like, and hypersensitivity almost. Like, for example, some days when I drive, like I'll notice I'm being hyper vigilant, where I'm like really edgy, or I'm like kind of like scared that something might pop out of somewhere. So that's hypervigilance. Um, Mood swings, that's something that happens a lot, I think, especially for folks who are like water signs, where we're really like connected to like our emotions and our body in a way that creates mood swings. That can be a symptom of trauma as well. And last but not least, actually it's like last on the list, but not the last of like all forms of symptoms of trauma. There's such a wide range. And actually this book I highly recommend this book because it's very readable. It's very short. And there are also 12 guided somatic healing practices that can help you begin the process of healing. I will say that it is written by a white man, Peter Levine. Yes, Peter Levine. It's called Healing Trauma by Peter A. Levine. I'll type it in the chat for you. It is a white man, and however, the information is really helpful. And actually, I don't know if Peter Levine even knows this or talks about this, but somatics is actually an Asian indigenous practice. If you think about like TCM or Hara, Hara in Japanese, it's all body-based healing that Asian indigenous folks have been practicing for years, and I have understood this information. And it was only until like with everything else, a white man put words to it, created an institution around it, that people started to take it seriously. So I just wanted to name all of that. So the last one on the list is shame, and it's a big one. There's a very huge collective shame trauma spell in our society. Like cancel culture is such a shaming trauma response that I think it's important to name on this list. Okay, so what's possible? What is possible? With slowness, right? Inching towards it rather than throwing ourselves into it. Titration, meaning little bits at a time. I like to say small doses of big emotions, right? That help create capacity. And care. So lots and lots of care when it comes to healing trauma. A lot of like caring for yourself, like taking more naps, eating really good food, sleeping well, having a peer support system. Care with slowness, titration, and care, trauma responses or symptoms can complete in its own time when we begin to listen to our body. I'll repeat that. With slowness, titration, and care, trauma responses or symptoms can complete in its own time when we begin to listen to the body, because the body is constantly sending us messages with the desire to heal, right? These symptoms are actually signals, messages that the body is sending to us that something's not right, that we want to heal. The body wants to heal. It has an inherent treatment plan for you. It knows and has its own pace, its own timing for healing. And we simply need to listen, create the time to care for ourselves, right? Last week we talked a lot about resourcing. When you resource and when you are feeling good in your body, trust that the trauma will naturally show itself how to heal, right? So hopefully this is creating a picture of possibility for you when it comes to healing. How's this landing for you, love? Yeah, understanding everything so well, I can recognize a lot of those trauma responses in myself. Yes, 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 yes. This is why I think that this work and this information is so important, because so much of our lives are trauma responses and we just don't know it. We think it's just like, something wrong with this, right? Like what Celine shared earlier. Like, it's not that there's something wrong with you. It's because we don't know how to meet these these very natural symptoms that our body is sending us. If anything, these symptoms become pathologized, and doctors will like say, yeah, you have PTSD, you have ADD, da da da, like, and like medicate, which only suppresses these responses. It doesn't actually heal and transform the trauma, right? So once I really begin to understand how trauma responses show up for me, and like knowing that it's a trauma response, I'm so much better able to meet myself, to get what I need, and to heal. So where do we begin, right? Basic needs, I talked about that. We have to feel like our basic needs are being met. Because again, this is what helps us create the capacity to meet trauma. If we don't have the capacity, then we're constantly exerting ourselves, overexerting our nervous system, and just doing like this accelerate, break thing with our nervous system, because we're not getting what we need. Yeah. Second is the somatic resourcing that we did earlier today. We talked about that last week, right? Going outside to nature, yoga class, working with your ancestors, rituals, breathing, Reiki, anything that helps you feel like your body has the capacity to be and meet intensity. And the third one that I added for today is start to begin to build body awareness. So first, somatic resourcing is like, it's more like an energetic thing where like I feel good in my body, right? But body awareness actually comes down a little bit more towards the sensation, the felt senses in the body. So earlier, Celine was talking about how she felt like there was like a pool, right? That is her body awareness. That is somatic awareness of what's happening within the body. And for me, what really helped, what started me on my journey of having more body awareness, was yoga. And it was the kind of yoga that required some exertion, because it required me to be really aware of my foot or the way my body felt in a certain pose. Other things like skating, dancing, running, like these all bring us into the body. It drops us out of our head and into the body. And with the practice of being in the body comes the capacity to notice sensations. And it's the sensations, the felt senses, that guide us when we follow those sensations. Like those are the ones that guide us towards healing, the time traveling and all of that. So I'm going to guide you through a body awareness exercise. Little cliff notes here. It's about what we already did a little, but essentially the reason why we want to have body awareness is because yoga at home, YouTube, someone. Yes, I do. So my friend, she is launching her website today, actually, because I built the website for her. But she is an Indian yoga teacher, and she has classes, I think, almost every day. And they're only $10 a class, so it's really accessible. And if you're a BIPOC, she has accessibility as well. Yeah, Pilgrimage of the Heart is in San Diego, and they have live stream classes. I like them because the quality is really great. It is a white-owned studio, but it's actually really accessible compared to like other yoga studio prices. So these are the two that I recommend. Okay, so with body awareness, yeah, let me know how it feels. So with body awareness, we practice this because sometimes it's not very easy to feel sensation in the body. We might know how to move our body. We have mobility. We have awareness of like how the body feels in general, but sometimes when we get to a little bit more specificity, which is needed for somatic healing, practicing this body awareness exercise can help us begin to grow that muscle. And so it will be short, and you can keep your eyes open for this. And we'll just begin by feeling your feet on the floor. So perhaps wiggling your toes and noticing if you can sense the texture of the floor and naming it. So you can say in your mind, this is my foot, these are my feet, these are my toes, and I'm touching the floor. The texture I'm feeling beneath my feet is rough, grainy. And then maybe see if you can notice it on the back of your body. So noticing the length of your spine against the chair or the couch or whatever you're sitting on. And perhaps, again, noticing textures, temperatures. So I feel warm. I can feel where the length of my spine is being supported feels really held. I'm noticing where my lower back is not meeting the back of my chair, feels hollow. Then maybe notice any weight in the body, perhaps in the arms. I placed my arms on my armchair and I can feel the weight of my arms on the chair. I can sense that I'm not constricting, instead I'm heavy. Sometimes I feel constricted, but right now I feel like my body is relaxed. And so this practice is creating the container of your body, right? Like you can feel like the skin that's like containing the body, because sometimes trauma, like one of you shared, like feels like it's out of the body, right? And so by gently bringing awareness to the container of the body, the limbs, the back body, the skin, the arm, we're beginning to bring our sense of awareness towards the body rather than it being outside or something out beyond us. And we're just starting with external limbs. We'll go deeper and deeper over the next coming weeks. Okay. How was that for you? What did that feel like? Did that feel easy, challenging, doable, not doable? What was that like for you? Okay, great. So I'm just going to stop the recording because we're at time. So hope to see you in 2 weeks.